And finally, we reach the last part of our review session. Our final unit of the term, policy, right? So we've talked about the foundations of our government, the institutions of our government, the politics in America, right? Basically how people get elected to these institutions and how our foundations, like the Constitution, affect this. And finally, we talk about policy, what the government actually produces. So all these people who run for office, all the institutions that we talked about in lawmaking and all that, the Constitution as a foundation, how all this comes together to actually create what the government does. So policy making can be thought of as basically a cycle, right? It's not a great idea to think of it as a linear process, but instead as a cycle. We see early phases, and people disagree a little bit on the phases. I think I actually include on my slides a different set of phases than your textbook uses. The basic idea is that we have a sort of early phase, an agenda setting phase, when we actually want to identify the problem and solutions to the problem, maybe many different solutions, right? Then we're going to select the most politically viable solution. And then we move on to our next phase, the actual policy formation, when Congress makes the law. We then see policy implementation. After Congress has made the law, formulated it, right, and the president has signed it, we now see the policy implemented. And this is where the bureaucracy comes in, right? They actually execute the laws for the president. So policy is implemented by the bureaucracy, at which point we want to evaluate the policy. Once a policy is implemented, did it work? If it did work, do we need to continue anything to have the policy keep going, right? Some policies have set time periods. For example, the assault weapons ban or the Violence Against Women Act. Those, or something that's probably a little more relevant to your lives, Pell Grants. Those programs, all three of those, have to be re-upped every so often. Congress has to reauthorize these programs. So if the evaluation has come around and we said, yes, these programs work, the new agenda is set, these programs are up for reauthorization. So we formulate the policy, presumably taking into consideration the evaluation. We do want to formulate a policy that re-implements these things, right? That re-ups the programs. Then we implement them again, and then we evaluate them again. Are they still working? And so on. It's a cycle, right? Obviously, if a program isn't working, that sets a different agenda, okay? We've created a program, we've implemented it. Turns out the program doesn't solve the problem that we originally identified in that agenda setting phase. So we now need to go back to the agenda setting phase and set a new agenda. We have a problem. The original problem was never solved. So now we need to figure out a different way to solve it. And we go through the cycle again. Now, there are different ways of sort of conceiving of policy. Generally, we typically look at foreign policy and domestic policy, and I've then divided up a little bit more and talked about economic policy for the class, right? So foreign policy is, shockingly enough, the U.S. policy towards foreign governments, right? Outward-facing policy. Policy about how we relate to other countries. So the U.S. has a lot of tools to execute foreign policy, even though, obviously, other countries are not beholden to our laws. So think about hard and soft power in this case, right? Hard power in foreign policy, not to be confused with issues like hard or soft money, right? Hard power is military power. So who has the ability to use military power? Well, we know the president, as commander-in-chief, can do an awful lot, right? He commands the military. But we do know that Congress has at least some checks on that. They fund the military. They have the power, they and they alone have the power to declare war. And, of course, under the War Powers Act, the president does have to report to them any troop movements after a certain time window. And Congress has the power to say, okay, well, we don't approve of this, bring them back now. They don't often execute this power, right? This is a pretty hollow check, and we sort of talked about that back when we were still in class, when we were talking about clashes between the president and Congress, and I said that because the president is often the first mover, it's hard for Congress to push back, and this was one of the examples I gave, right? The president's military power. He's the first mover. Now, for soft powers, the president still does have a lot of say here. Soft powers are anything else. So things like diplomacy, one of the reasons we have a unitary executive is because we wanted a figurehead to represent the country in negotiations with foreign countries. So the president is sort of our chief diplomat, right? And under the president is the Department of State, which acts as the diplomatic service for the U.S., right? Our ambassadors and stuff are part of the State Department. Our Secretary of State generally will go and represent the U.S. in negotiations for any sort of foreign negotiation, right? Peace treaties when we're at war, trade agreements, right? New terms for recognizing the status of a country, right? All sorts of things like that are handled primarily by the executive branch, right? The president and his bureaucracy. But we do see that Congress has some say here too. Congress has to ratify treaties. Now, we know that Congress has to actually pass the bill over to the president for the president to sign into law, and yet the president can issue executive orders, which bypass Congress. The same thing is true in international affairs. The president can issue executive agreements, which are kind of like treaties, but they go around Congress. And just like executive orders have to be self-funding or not require funding at all, executive agreements have to do the same thing. So something like the Kyoto Protocols, which actually Congress never ratified, would have set binding limits on certain U.S. fossil fuel emissions. That was done by treaty because that would have actually required certain government action that the president could not unilaterally take. However, when Obama was then negotiating for the Paris Agreement, he remembered Clinton's experience with the Kyoto Protocol and avoided Congress and made it an executive agreement. But just like with executive orders, executive agreements can be overturned by the next president. We saw that happen with the Paris Agreement, right? Trump has withdrawn the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. And that process takes quite a long time, but he has initiated it. So I think actually I will skip to the second to last bullet. We'll skip over healthcare and go back to that, right? We see that environmental policy can be talked about either in terms of domestic policy, what the U.S. is doing alone, or international policy. And we, for the most part, talked about it from an international standpoint in this class, right? Because obviously the U.S. is not alone in the world. So when we talk about global climate change, it is inherently an international issue. If tomorrow the U.S. were to cut fossil fuel emissions to zero, that wouldn't be enough because other countries are going to have to get involved. Right? Other countries need to cut their emissions too to make a difference. Now, obviously, we know the U.S. is a massive fossil fuel emitter, so if we were to overnight cut our emissions to zero, obviously that would have a pretty big impact on the global climate, but it probably wouldn't be enough because, again, other countries would still be emitting fossil fuels. So we all need to work together because if not, we're all going to end up emitting too many fossil fuels, and this will lead to a tragedy of the commons, right? You can think of the global climate as the commons, or even if you don't just want the planet as a commons. You can't exclude anyone from the planet. You can't say, I don't like you French people, I'm going to exclude you now, go live on the moon, right? Can't be done. Everyone has access to the planet. I'm picking on the French because I have a lot of British family members and they pick on the French, but I actually have nothing against the French. But my enjoyment of the planet, or America's enjoyment of the planet, right? Use of the climate by just recklessly emitting fossil fuels, or even not recklessly, just by emitting fossil fuels, can eventually lead to sort of subtractability, right? Our enjoyment of the climate means that other people won't be able to enjoy it, right? The fact that the US is emitting a ton of fossil fuels means that European countries, if they want to keep the target set by the Paris Accords, will now have to cut their emissions significantly more to make up for US emissions, right? Because the climate globe is subtractable. So this leads to tragedy of the commons, right? Where no one really wants to sort of take the short-term pain of lowering emissions. Everyone just wants to willy-nilly use fossil fuels and develop and industrialize as quick and as easily and as cheaply as possible. But that will eventually lead to the ruination of the planet, right? So, tragedy of the commons. Now, we can look at other collective action issues in terms of healthcare policy and free riders, right? We can certainly talk about environmental policy and free riders because they go hand in hand with the tragedy of the commons, but we specifically illustrated it with healthcare policy and the Young Invincibles free riding on healthcare, right? These Young Invincibles felt like, well, health insurance is expensive. I'm probably not going to get sick. I'm young and healthy. Why would I all of a sudden need a lot of health care? I'm not going to buy insurance. And if on some off chance something catastrophic happens, I can go to an emergency room and get treatment for free. So they're literally free riding. Getting something for nothing, right? And they're free riding on the people who are buying health insurance and on the people who are paying their taxes to support the public side of most emergency rooms. So, these free riders pose a problem to universal health care coverage. It's not that universal health coverage was intended to just cover the free riders. Obama didn't necessarily care that much about covering people who didn't want coverage. Certainly, he wanted to cover young people who might want coverage but who were having trouble affording it after they get out of college, right? That's why he raised it so that kids who are not full-time students who are under 26 can still be on their parents' health care. So he did care about covering young people who wanted coverage, but he didn't necessarily care about covering people who didn't want coverage. So why try to eliminate these free riders? Because if they pay for coverage, they actually lower the cost for everyone. And his concern with universal health care was really to help ensure people who wanted insurance but couldn't get it because they couldn't afford it. People, say, with pre-existing conditions. So if you, God forbid, had cancer but happily survived it, you are now in remission, it is actually very difficult. Before the Affordable Care Act, it was very difficult for you to get health care. And if you did get health care, usually these policies were either extremely expensive because they knew that if you had a relapse and had cancer again, they'd be shelling out a lot of money for your care, or they would have exclusion riders, which basically would say things like, we will cover you for anything but health issues related to your pre-existing condition. So basically, if you got cancer again, they wouldn't cover the treatment, which obviously the point of getting health insurance is to cover those kind of things. So Obama wanted to eliminate all those exceptions to make it so that people who had pre-existing conditions who wanted insurance could pay the same price for the same coverage as a person who was previously healthy, right? So to do that, you need to convince insurance companies to lower the cost to these really high-risk people. High-risk people, high risk for the insurance company to insure, because they would cost the insurance company a lot of money if they got sick again. So insurance companies needed basically healthy people to pay in and not end up collecting. So that's why Obama needed to eliminate free riders in order to get his Affordable Care Act to actually work, right? In order to get insurance companies to agree to pay for pre-existing conditions, he had to offer them these low-risk customers as well. Now, interestingly, eliminating free riding and things like individual mandate are actually very conservative ideas because they help correct for market failures. And generally, conservative ideology, right? Usually, this maps to Republican ideology, but not always. Generally, conservative ideology has faith in the marketplace over government. And much of the Affordable Care Act actually had these sort of market solutions to insurance rather than government solutions. Possibly because it was modeled after Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts, and obviously Mitt Romney was a Republican and generally did follow a conservative ideology when he was there. Now, the other big collective action problem we talk about, prisoner's dilemma, is really well illustrated with the concept of entitlement reform, right? Entitlements are those programs that we pay into and are then entitled to receive money back out of. So Social Security and Medicare, as well as Medicaid, which we don't necessarily pay into and then receive money out of. But it is also considered an entitlement. Now again, we're entitled to these things because we have contributed in some way to them, right? Medicaid, generally the people benefiting aren't necessarily people who paid in, but you can be. So again, these entitlements, and specifically in this case, entitlement reform is only referring to Medicare, the old age health insurance, and Social Security, old age insurance. So both of these are things you pay into when you are paid by your employer, you pay into these programs, and you are entitled to get money out of them once you're older and retired. And in the case of Medicare, occasionally if you become disabled and can no longer work, right? So you're entitled to them because you've paid into them. The problem is because the current workers actually pay for the current benefits, so if you are working, the money that is being taken out of your paycheck is actually going to current retirees. The problem is that the baby boomers are all starting to retire, and that is a massive generation. But they didn't actually fully replace themselves with the Gen Xers and millennials. So there are fewer people paying in per person benefiting than ever before. There's still more than one person paying in for every person taking out, but the number is dramatically different from what it used to be. And this means that at some point the program will become insolvent and we won't be able to pay out all the benefits people are entitled to. And this leads us to a prisoner's dilemma. Any way to make the program solvent, or at least push insolvency further down the road, will lead to short-term pain. Someone is going to be upset with the solution, and this could potentially lead to Congress members being voted out of office. So no one wants to propose these unpopular solutions. But the thing is no one being willing to propose these solutions means that we're never going to solve insolvency. And that's going to be so much worse. If they're still in Congress when Social Security is insolvent and suddenly all these retirees stop getting their paychecks, we know old people vote more than young people. You don't think every one of the retirees who now can't get Social Security isn't going to vote the Congress members out of office who let this happen? You don't think a lot of older people who are in their 40s and 50s, who are expecting to collect Social Security and have been paying in for their entire working lives for decades, you don't think they're going to vote these people who let it go insolvent out of office? So it's much worse if they allow it to go insolvent. But because they can't trust the other party to agree to painful solutions, they feel it is sort of politically safer in the short term to basically point fingers and sit back. right? At some point, insolvency is going to be so soon and so looming that they're going to have to come together and negotiate a solution. When they do, likely this will be done in private, as it was before, right? Because we talked about with the Constitution, when compromises are made, it's much better if they're done in private, because then no one is to blame. Because at the end of the day, you just have to go, well, okay, this is what we've gotten. Rather than, say, a Democrat who wants to raise the FICA tax, the contributions you pay into the program, and maybe a Republican wants to raise retirement age. So what if they agree to raise FICA taxes by half of what the Democrat was suggesting and raise the retirement age by half of what the Republican was suggesting? That's a great deal. But if they don't trust each other to keep quiet about that and just present the whole plan, the Democrat might well go out and say, oh my God, those Republicans want to make you work 10 more years. All I proposed was a slight increase in FICA taxes that would be borne by everyone, but you'd all get something out of it at the end of the day. But they want you to work for another decade. How horrible that they don't value your hard work and think you should be rewarded for it. And the Republicans are going to come out and they're going to say, those tax and spend Democrats, I am saying that Social Security is for people who worked for it. You've worked all your life for it, and you'll work a little longer, but you will get it. And all they want to do is tax you so much that you can't afford anything, because they want to be able to support all those lazy idiots who don't pay into the program. Right? You can kind of hear that happening. That sounds, a lot like what the parties would say. But if they would just come together, make the compromise, not point fingers, do this all in secret, and come out and say, we've saved Social Security, it would be great. They'd be heroes. And people would put up with the short-term costs because it was framed as we save Social Security. So if they could just trust each other to cooperate and not try to score cheap political points early on, they would. But, unfortunately, with insolvency still pretty far down the road in political time anyway, no one's quite there yet. No one's really willing to trust each other. But this sort of outside enforcement of insolvency will probably eventually force them to come to some sort of cooperative deal. Just like we saw with discussions of the fiscal cliff, right? They're willing to get right up to the cliff, but they're not willing to actually drive us off the cliff. So that cliff eventually sort of forces cooperation. Same thing with the Constitution. At the end of the day, there were a lot of compromises that made a lot of people very unhappy. But they still needed the Constitution, and they couldn't just walk away from it because they were unhappy with the compromises. So we can see, again, that sort of this outside enforcement, in this case the threat of something much, much worse, will eventually help facilitate collective action in cases of a prisoner's dilemma. At least when we talk about things like entitlement reform. Now, we've sort of already touched on this question. What role does each branch of government play in policy making? Obviously, we know the executive can set the agenda in domestic and economic policy making. We know that they have a lot of power in foreign policy making as commander-in-chief and chief diplomat. But we know the legislature is also involved, right? The legislature has to pass treaties. They have to fund any foreign policy endeavors. They have to fund the military and any peacekeeping forces, or any programs from the State Department in terms of diplomacy, right? So all these things are funded by the legislature. The legislature also obviously makes regular law. So any domestic policies that are made through regular law, which are, the vast majority of them, come through Congress. And then the president obviously can sign them or veto them. We do see the court get involved sometimes, right? We talked about this in terms of Roe v. Wade and privacy, and Griswold versus Connecticut and privacy, right? Roe v. Wade and that trimester system reads an awful lot like law and not like a Supreme Court decision. Saw the same thing with Brown versus Board of Education. That idea of all deliberate speed. is kind of starting to get into legislating and not just a judicial ruling. Judicial ruling, pure and simple, would be separate but equal is unconstitutional. Done. But then they started getting into suggestions about desegregation and saying you don't have to do it overnight, all deliberate speed is fine, right? That's more legislative language than judicial language. So we see that the court can play a role in policymaking, though it is certainly a much smaller role than the political branches play. So that's it, right? That's our entire class in a relative nutshell. If you have any questions on the exam structure or content, feel free to email me. You'll notice I also posted the exam instructions as a narrated video and as slides, so you should read them and familiarize yourself with them before you take the exam, so nothing surprising on there. I've also posted a new photo how-to on how to take the online test on Blackboard. I've posted these review slides as just slides, and I've posted a study guide which has some sample true-false questions and a word bank that will help you both with the fill-in-the-blank questions and more generally, because obviously the words in the word bank, even if they don't end up on the fill-in-the-blank questions, may end up elsewhere. So please take a look at those. Again, if you have any questions on anything, feel free to ask me. I'm also going to post a discussion board on our review class day, and that date's on the syllabus. I will post a discussion board and open that up for any questions any of you have. I encourage you to use that to ask questions and also to answer your classmates' questions, because in answering the questions, you are basically checking your own knowledge and synthesizing these concepts in a way to answer their question that helps you learn them better. And then obviously I'll keep checking, answer questions that are not answered, and correct any misunderstandings if they occur. So good luck, everyone, and it's been a great semester. It's such a shame to sort of say goodbye to you on a PowerPoint slide online instead of in person, but, such is life right now, and I hope I'll see all your exams, and please, again, be in touch either on the discussion board or by email if you have any questions in the lead up to the exam, and obviously if there's any issues when you're taking the exam. All right. Thanks, guys.